Before you listen, if you enjoy the stories and want to hear more, then please consider subscribing. Most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please take this time to subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story and be the first to hear. You'll also be supporting me. Thank you. It was a classic stupid teenage dare that got my best friend Riley and I into trouble one night. We were bored looking for a thrill when she and I didn't have the guts to sneak into the old cemetery on the edge of town after dark. Never one to back down from a challenge, I insisted I would not only go, but stay an entire hour just to prove I wasn't afraid. Riley called my bluff and said she'd tag along to see me chicken out. So at midnight, fueled by false bravado, we crept from my backyard into the shadows to where the rusted iron gates half a mile away. We've all heard the stories about that cemetery, planted more than 2 centuries ago. People reported hauntings, voices on the wind, statues that seemed to watch you. Most level-headed folks in town avoided the place unless absolutely necessary. But Riley and I were idiots, too young to take such legends seriously. Scaling the high fence was easy enough once we found a spot hidden from the street. My adrenaline pumped as we dropped down onto the overgrown grass. This was crazy without a doubt, but I couldn't lose my nerve now. At first, the old graveyard seemed peaceful, bathed in moonlight. Crooked rows of weathered headstones lined the rolling hills. Ancient twisted oaks spread their limbs between the plots. As we followed the winding dirt path, I glanced at cryptic inscriptions and makeshift shrines left by descendants. Riley lurked behind, rustling bushes and humming creepily, trying to rattle me. But I just shushed her, worried she'd get us caught. Near the heart of the cemetery, we came across a huge marble mausoleum, its columns carved with angels and demons. Riley dared me to touch the rusted padlock on its entrance, as if that would awaken spirits. I rolled my eyes at her antics, but my bravado was fading. This place felt heavier, more foreboding. Every snapping twig put me on alert as we wandered deeper. That's when Riley scampered up the hillside, cackling loudly and disappearing behind a row of graves. I hissed at her to stop, glancing around nervously for any security guards. The moon ducked behind clouds, plunging the cemetery into inky blackness. Disturbed by the shift, I decided to gather Riley so we could head out before our luck ran dry. But as I climbed the hill toward where she'd gone, an eerie groan stopped me in my tracks. I froze, peering down at the old graves alongside me. The noise came again like a pained exhale from below the dirt. My skin crawled, realizing it was emanating from inside one of the crumbling tombs. No way could it be Riley pulling this stunt. Pure primal fear gripped me. I stumbled backward, ready to make a break for the gates. But I couldn't just abandon Riley, as tempting as it was. As the third anguished groan rose from the ground, Riley's shriek sounded from afar. I scrambled recklessly toward it, calling her name. The terrain was treacherous in the darkness, but I had to get to her. My mind raced with what evil could be at work here. Up ahead, I heard Riley crying and ran faster. She nearly tackled me in relief when I found her huddled behind a tree. Between sobs, she said she'd heard terrible noises from below after leaving me. I seized her hand and we fled, half expecting arms to reach out and grab our ankles as we raced over graves. Nearly flying over the fence, we ran without pause until the glowing windows of my house emerged up ahead. We collapsed on the back porch, panting and shaking. Once inside my bedroom, with blankets pulled over our heads, we compared our haunting experiences in the graveyard. Riley admitted she'd only been trying to joke around. She never expected things to turn so sinister. Now we truly understood why decent folks avoided that place at night. We tempted fate too far. Neither of us slept a wink that night, listening for any creaks outside my window. But the true horror lingered in our minds, not from something stalking us, but the evil we awoken. At dawn, when the police knocked on my door, our parents beside them glaring, we spilled everything. Riley and I were badly shaken, but also knew we'd brought it on ourselves. Like so many horror movie victims, we let teenage hubris lure us someplace we never belonged. We waited for punishment, either legal or parental, but to our surprise, the police just warned us to never trespass there again. They had more pressing issues than teenage antics. Our parents even went easy, sensing our remorse. But the real lesson sank in that morning. Some rules exist for a reason. The dead are not to be disturbed. Whatever restless evil we experienced in that cemetery wasn't done toying with us. Even now, years later, I feel its sinister energy stirring when I pass that place, waiting. Cemeteries of a certain age should not be trespassed. What lies beneath doesn't always remain buried. Riley and I learned that truth firsthand. But fate was on our side, giving us a second chance most foolhardy teens wouldn't get. We escaped the graves unscathed to become wiser adults. Visiting my father's grave has always brought a mix of melancholy comfort and sorrow. He tragically passed away from cancer when I was only 7 years old, so my memories of him are tragically vague, but filled with warmth and love. My mom often reminds me that I have his big hazel eyes and lively, energetic spirit, despite not knowing him long. To keep his memory alive, she brings me to tidy his cemetery plot a few times each year, more for my benefit, I think, than her own peace of mind. We care for the simple granite headstone, lay fresh flowers, and I talk to him silently in my mind, updating him on my life. It's a cathartic tradition, making his devastating physical absence feel a bit less acute, but this last visit took an eerie, haunting turn I don't think I'll ever forget. It started normally enough as Mom and I parked the car along the wrought iron fence near the front gates of the peaceful local cemetery on a sunny Tuesday morning. We unloaded the daily gardening tools from the trunk along with a bouquet of lovely fresh daisies, his favorite bright flower. The grounds were quiet and nearly empty on a weekday, with just a few other visiting mourners dispersed around the expansive rolling green grounds. As we approached Dad's simple plot in a shady corner near a towering oak tree, I felt the now familiar melancholy wash over me, mourning the limited time I was able to have with him, but also feeling grateful my mom kept his vibrant spirit alive through memories and stories over the years. We got to work briskly weeding and tidying the area around the gray, polished granite headstone while chatting lightly about my classes and college plans, almost including my dad as part of the conversation. After nearly an hour working in the dappled sunshine, we decided to take a leisurely stroll along the winding paved pathways throughout the sprawling cemetery before heading home. We were in no rush, and the sunny spring weather was perfect for enjoying a quiet, contemplative walk together. As we meandered slowly past rows of various headstones and crypts, reading names and poignant epitaphs, something at the edge of my vision made me halt abruptly. Behind a large nearby marble mausoleum, a lone man stood off in the distance watching us. He appeared middle-aged, perhaps in his 50s, wearing casual clothes and a faded blue baseball cap. At that distance, his features were indistinct, but something about his posture and silhouette seemed eerily, hauntingly familiar. I felt magnetically drawn towards him for reasons I couldn't quite verbalize or pinpoint logically. Then suddenly it struck me with chilling intensity. In the way he carried himself, he was the absolute spitting image of my late father based on old family photographs. The resemblance was unmistakable and uncanny. In my periphery, his mournful eyes almost seemed to meet mine, probing my soul. I must have gasped audibly because my mom paused beside me and asked with concern what was the matter. When I pointed urgently toward the direction of the unknown man, she peered over, squinting behind her sunglasses, but insisted she could not locate anyone matching the description of my father's ghostly doppelganger. I kept trying anxiously to keep the figure in sight between the headstones as we circled the perimeter of a large granite monument. But oddly, almost supernaturally, when we reached the other side merely seconds later, the mysterious man was gone without a trace, having completely vanished. I was certain beyond doubt that no other mourners had passed by us on the empty pathway, nor had anyone exited through the lone cemetery gate in the distance. He had simply evaporated into thin air. My mom gently suggested it must have been a groundskeeper or other visitor who coincidentally resembled my late father and had walked behind a tree or building out of view when we lost sight of him briefly. But I felt deep in my bones that I had witnessed something unnatural, the phantom of my beloved father still lingering near his physical remains. I became singularly obsessed with finding where the spectral figure had disappeared to. Making flimsy excuses over my mom's protests and warnings, I darted off down the winding gravel paths between the rows of headstones, scrutinizing every possible hiding spot for any sign of the elusive man. As I rounded a corner into a more secluded section of the cemetery surrounded densely by soaring rhododendron bushes and ivy, I stumbled to a halt. There down an empty, narrow lane stood the familiar form facing away from me halfway down. Heart positively thrumming in my chest now, I approached cautiously and called out to the stoic figure. He did not flinch or acknowledge me. But as I drew nearer, propelled by forces I cannot explain, the man slowly turned to face my direction and proceeded to stride purposefully down the shadowy lane between the crypts and markers. I picked up my pace, almost jogging to catch up to him before he could disappear again. But when I had breathlessly rounded the slight bend, the claustrophobic lane ended abruptly at a high stone wall overtaken by mosses and vines. No gate, no intersecting path, no visible route of escape. I spun around, desperately scanning every direction and corner for where the phantom could have vanished to this time, but the enclosed area was completely deserted. The mysterious man had evaporated once again like a ghost into the cemetery air, leaving me rattled and shaken. Spooked by the inexplicable encounter, I stumbled back aimlessly to the main gravel path, sincerely hoping my distraught mother had not gone to seek help or call authorities to search for me. Luckily, she was still there pacing anxiously, and turned to greet me with a collision of relief and irritation. But her frustration melted into empathy as I frantically described what I had witnessed on my wild pursuit. She struggled to come up with a rational justification to explain away the eerie man's unbelievable resemblance to my deceased father and his bizarre elusive behavior. In the end, we left the cemetery grounds in unsettled silence, the lovely morning now tainted by my series of bizarre experiences. Over the many long sleepless nights since, I've racked my brain to the point of obsession trying to analyze every detail and make sense of it all logically. Part of me wants to wholeheartedly believe I genuinely spotted my father's watchful spirit, keeping close guard near his remains and visiting loved ones from the afterlife. But another more cynical part of my mind wonders if it could have just been a random stranger who coincidentally bore an uncanny facial resemblance to my dad. If it was indeed a paranormal visitation, why didn't his specter reveal himself fully and transparently to me? I've always felt an alluring fascination with cemeteries, finding their tranquility and history captivating. So when I first learned of an enormous 300-year-old cemetery bordering the outskirts of my town, I knew I had to investigate and explore the undoubtedly intriguing grounds. On a sunny, mildly eerie fall afternoon, I packed my vintage camera, a notebook, and a detailed map I'd found online mapping the sprawling cemetery layout. At the time, I envisioned a peaceful day photographing the old, ornate grave markers and stone mausoleums, blissfully unaware of the bizarre and chilling events that would slowly unfold for me once I passed beneath the towering wrought iron gates. I entered cautiously along the crumbling stone wall lining the perimeter, finding myself on a gravel pathway cutting through rolling emerald hills filled with ancient weathered headstones dotted haphazardly around moss-covered memorials and striking marble statues. Perched on a far hill sat an imposing Gothic mausoleum constructed of heavy onyx granite, looming over the grounds like a watchful sentinel. But most of the simpler graves bore modest markers with faded, lichen-covered engraved epitaphs and slender Celtic crosses untended for centuries. Several more only hand-chiseled names and dates rendered fully illegible by the slow erosion of time. I wondered curiously about the forgotten lives and untold stories that lay buried for eternity beneath the tangled weeds and earth only feet below my feet. As I wandered slowly deeper into the property, the gently swaying trees cast writhing shadows that seemed to follow just behind me as I passed. Although it was just past midday, only a few stray beams of sunlight permeated the dense canopy high above. The deeper I ventured along the overgrown pathways, the heavier and more ominous the very air itself felt pressing down on my shoulders. I attempted to shrug off the creeping unease, chalking it up simply to decades of cold neglect and undisturbed decay. When I came across a large, deteriorating stone angel memorial with a drastically weathered face and missing head, I paused in fascination to retrieve my camera in order to document the eerie sight. But as I aimed the viewfinder, my digital camera abruptly died, the lens unexpectedly retracting, despite my certainty that I had fully charged it just that morning. Perplexed by the bizarre malfunction, I stashed the inner device back in my bag and continued exploring farther into the property rather than turning back. The deeper I trekked across the sprawling grounds, the more pronounced the signs of decay and vandalism became on the forgotten tombs around me. Fallen and broken pillars littered my path alongside collapsed mausoleums being slowly reclaimed by knotted weeds and ivy. I passed by a strangely stagnant algae-coated pond with an intensely foreboding atmosphere and unnatural dark crimson tint that didn't strike me as merely accidental neglect. The bent iron fence originally enclosing the pond had been broken with several bars pulled aside, now padlocked shut, but with a gap just large enough to sloppily enter by squeezing through. Something about the foul body of water instinctively repulsed me, yet also compelled me to move closer and peer cautiously through the rusted bars into the opaque, brackish depths. Just below the thick mirrored surface, floating objects seemed to shift about slowly. As I leaned down to stare harder into the pond's scary secrets, a bloated, decomposing hand suddenly burst up through the scummy surface right in front of my face. I involuntarily shrieked and jumped back, stifling a scream as a hideously pale, rotted corpse partially rose from the shadows before sinking slowly back down into the blood-hued pool, creating ripples. Staggering several feet away in utter shock and choking back bile rising in my throat, I also glimpsed what appeared menacingly to be a dark body bag bobbing along beside it. My heart positively raced out of my chest as my mind scrambled to make sense of the nightmarish tableau. Was this some sort of twisted, morbid prank with fake corpses meant to terrify random passersby? Breathing fast and frantically scanning the surroundings for any hidden perpetrators, I attempted to hurry swiftly away from the traumatic scene, but tripped over the crumbling curb edge, letting out an involuntary whimper. How could no one else visiting these sprawling grounds have noticed literal human bodies dumped so brazenly in this foul pond? I fumbled desperately to retrieve my cell phone from my bag with shaking hands, hoping to call for help or at least someone to confide in. But I found it also mysteriously fully powered down and unresponsive, despite my certainty that it had been over halfway charged when I left home. Now utterly helpless and vulnerable, almost paralyzed by surging adrenaline, I felt unseen eyes inexplicably tracking my movements from somewhere between the dark mausoleums as I attempted to find an escape path. I thought I could detect faint whispers uttering ominous words floating on the wind as I hurried alone through row after row of crypts and obelisks towering overhead around me like a maze of granite and marble. Seeking any route out, I veered sharply down an overgrown, narrow trail I spotted between two crumbling walls, hoping it would somehow lead me to a public area or at least a side exit gate. But the path's dense, low-hanging branches seemed to reach out and claw at me like skeletal hands as I stumbled on. I pushed through anxiously, my pace quickening rapidly from a fast walk nearly to an all-out panicked run for survival. But ahead of me, the trail terminated at an ivy-choked, towering brick wall, cutting off any progress. When I turned hastily to double back, my breath caught in my lungs as I realized the pathway I had blindly followed mere moments ago had become completely obscured behind me by the intentionally misleading snarl of underbrush and tightly woven tree limbs. There would be no retracing my steps. I was trapped. A sudden deafening crack directly behind me like a clap of thunder or gunshot echoed through the maze, making me yell out in terror, certain I was marked for death next. Whirling around in a crouch, I watched with dread as a massive leaning tombstone splintered and toppled at the spot I had been standing just seconds earlier. There was not a single doubt left in my mind that something sinister and beyond rational explanation wanted me to remain forever in this hellish labyrinth of the dead. Dropping to my knees on the dirt in full acceptance of my doomed fate, I braced myself for whatever came next. But oddly, only eerie silence followed. Gradually catching my ragged, panicked breath once again, I pulled myself shakily to my feet using the vines covering the wall. As I peered desperately over the brink, I could see in the hazy distance the elaborate wrought iron gate of the cemetery's entrance I had passed through earlier that morning, although it now seemed an eternity ago. One final barrier lay between it and my freedom, a vast choking sea of knee-high dead weeds and thorns that stretched on without end. Mustering my last ounce of courage and adrenaline, I dove recklessly into the ominous undergrowth headfirst like a soldier under heavy fire. At times crawling on hands and knees, when completely obscured from view, the thorns and branches clawed and shredded my clothes and skin relentlessly. But I was too desperate to notice or care about wounds. Up ahead, the blessed afternoon sunlight broke through the gloom, beckoning me forward. With a final surge of reckless strength, I burst violently from the weed line, scraped and bleeding, and sprinted at full speed for the iron gates now blessedly in sight. I never once slowed my crazed pace until finally within the supposed safety of my car, doubled over gasping for air and sanity. Driving cautiously home, still trembling from shock, I knew there was not a single soul who would ever fully believe the story of what I had witnessed and experienced firsthand. Thanks for listening in.
If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.